Okay, Fry here. Hi, good morning. As I'm recording this, it's Saturday morning on Memorial Day weekend in the U.S. In the U.S., this is the traditional start of summer, the summer season. And Memorial Day, I think, is a fitting time to remember the many victims of U.S. imperialism around the world. And a bit earlier this month, we've seen the most recent example of it, Israeli aggression against the indigenous population, the Palestinians. And Israel is massively couldn't do this without massive U.S. military and political support. So Israel is an extension of U.S. imperialism. Okay, there are people who could analyze the details list or go over the details list far better than I could, so I won't. Basically, some things though. Over the course of 11 days, 231 Palestinians were killed in Gaza, and this includes 60 children. Uh, a 13-story residential high-rise was taken down, was destroyed, leaving thousands homeless. Another residential tower, which were the headquarters of AP News Service and Al Jazeera, was destroyed. The IDF said they had evidence that there was Hamas base in this building, but no credible evidence was produced. Bet Salam, the largest Israeli human rights organization, said it's nonsense. There's no evidence. They were using that. Israelis were using it as an excuse to target journalists, which happens all the time. Interestingly, a few days after that, AP News Service fired a young woman, basically an intern, because it came out that in high school she had been involved in pro-Palestinian rights activism. I mean, they're utterly so shows the utter servile nature of U.S. media. They're utterly servile to state power. Okay, so here's that the only COVID-19 testing clinic in Gaza was destroyed. The doctor who was in charge of the COVID relief programs in Gaza who was killed. Doctors Without Border clinic was destroyed. There were thousands of people who were left homeless. There were heartbreaking story after story. There are stories of families who had to decide whether to stay in one place and take the chance they'd all be killed, or separate, or chances some people would survive. There's a father whose 12-year-old daughter was killed, and the rest of his family have been killed earlier and earlier Israeli assaults. There are heartbreaking stories and stories. So, the traditional mainstream narrative, at least until recently, in defense of Israel, said something like, yeah, Israel's bad, they do bad things, but the Palestinians use stupid bargaining tactics. They want everything. They're rejectionists. They want it all, while Israelis more compromised and they get more and more. And also Hamas, by their missile attacks, they invite this devastation to traditional narratives. Well, Norman Finkelstein, who is one of the most prominent U.S. Palestinian solidarity rights activists, I'll explain a bit more who he is in a minute. Norman Finkelstein had an interesting pushback on this. He recently, a week ago, I guess, had a Zoom meeting with students in Toronto, the Toronto Students for Free Speech, something like that. And he had some really interesting takes. Norman Finkelstein is one of the most interesting analysts. So basically, he said, let's put it into some context. Gaza is one of the most highly populated, densely populated places on the planet. There are 2 million people in a space in an area twice the size of New York City's Central Park. And of those 2 million people, half, like a million people, are under 18. That is, there are a million children. Every time you bomb Gaza, it's inevitable you'll kill children. It's like a fish in a barrel. So there's that. So Gaza, 70% of the population are refugees or immediate descendants of refugees. They had the country taken from them, essentially. There's a lot of poverty, unemployment. There's no drinkable water in Gaza. It's been under siege for the past 14 years. I believe it's 2004, 2005, I'm not sure. But they elected Hamas as democratically elected Hamas. There's a Israeli U.S.-sponsored coup which failed to overthrow them, but they're the democratically elected government. So in response, Israel and also Egypt cooperating enacted this brutal siege against Gaza. Not for 14 years, like a medieval siege. Nothing can get in or out without Israelis allowing it. And they're severely restricting food intake, this and that. And there are no bomb shelters in Gaza. They are all over Israel, but there are no bomb shelters. Israelis won't allow materials for building it, and so on. So put into some historical context. Also, the people of Gaza and the Palestinians in general have been subject to constant brutal assaults, not just recently, but for many, many decades. Oh, yeah, before I get, Norman Finkelstein said, Gaza is the world's largest open air prison camp, open air prison. But he takes that a step further. He quoted I think a Canadian sociologist, I forget her name, but he quoted this woman before. She said before the siege, the 14-year siege of Gaza, even before that, she characterized Gaza as the world's largest concentration camp. And I think that's that. And Finkelstein says he thinks that's accurate. And Norman Finkelstein is a guy, his parents were at Auschwitz, and most of his extended family were killed in the Holocaust. So he's not using the term concentration camp lightly. So I think it's a pretty horrific situation. So, and take this also, Finkelstein put this in more deeper historical context. As I said, the people of Palestine and of Gaza has been subject to constant brutal assaults on and on. People say, well, why don't they have nonviolent resistance? Why don't the Palestinians have nonviolent resistance? They've tried it. It doesn't work. In 2018, there was a protest march, peaceful protest march. They emphasized it was peaceful. I think 20,000 people in Gaza marched to the border, Israeli border, to protest, and the IDF gunned them down. 18 people were killed and at least about 1,000 people were wounded. Among the 18 people who were killed were several journalists and a guy in a wheelchair and many teenagers. It was pretty horrific. And there are other examples. Let's do more of the smaller, but peaceful marches, demonstrations, even kids throwing rocks, and the IDF gunned them down. This happens fairly often. There was the 214 Israeli IDF invasion of Gaza. So that was in retaliation for three Jewish teenagers being in the West Bank, and illegal settlement in the West Bank. They were kidnapped and killed by Hamas. And I don't support this, but the retaliation was massively disproportionate, like massively. 2,000 Gazans were killed, thousands were wounded, many children were killed. And this kind of stuff happens over and over like clockwork. The Israelis invade Gaza like every 3 years. They've been doing this since the early 2000s or so. So that's some of the historical context. And Finkelstein yes, it said, as far as what Hamas does, is I'm not a military strategist. I can't pretend to be a military strategist, but he compared what Hamas was doing to Poland when they were invaded by the Germans in the Second World War, Blitzkrieg tactics. The Poles used cavalry or 19th century cavalry or antiquated tanks against, at the time, the high-tech German Blitzkrieg. It was obviously doomed to failure, but it was a matter of dignity, preserving their dignity and national spirit. And he thinks maybe something like that. He also said he thinks supposedly Hamas had 400,000 missiles. The IDF claimed they had 400,000 missiles. He thinks most of them were fireworks. The missiles they did have appear to be far more accurate and far further range. I'll talk about that in a minute. Finkelstein also had some interesting advice for young activists, Palestinian solidarity activists. He doesn't think the term Zionism is appropriate anymore. I mean, the term Zionism, there was a historical Zionist movement, of course, but he thinks it's no longer appropriate. Any people from Noam Chomsky to Netanyahu call themselves a Zionist. Noam Chomsky he probably still does. He's kind of a soft Zionist, a cultural Zionist. He lived on a kibbutz in Israel back in the early 60s. He's kind of a cultural soft Zionist. He said something like he thinks Israeli statehood would inevitably destroy the socialist institutions of Israel, and he was right. Whatever there was, the original kibbutzes, of course, Israel did not allow Palestinians. So anyway, and then Benjamin Netanyahu is also a Zionist. So he said, Finkelstein said, the term now has become so amorphous it no longer makes sense. He thinks a better term for people to use would be Jewish supremacy, because people, he had big parallels. So there are big parallels with the George Floyd protests last summer, the Black Lives Matter movement. There are big parallels, and people are sensitive to like white supremacy. People are more sensitive and open to this. So he thinks a more appropriate term would be Jewish supremacy. Israel is an ethno-state. And Finkelstein went on to say he doesn't think apartheid is an appropriate term to use. I mean, Israel is an apartheid state. I think it's a good term, but he doesn't think it's a good term because it's associated with South Africa 30 years ago, and young people today are not as familiar with what happened in South Africa. He brings up some really interesting points. Now, who Finkelstein is, he is an American academic. He was at DePaul University in Chicago, and he became famous as a Palestinian rights activist. One book I read from the Holocaust industry, which is really quite good, talk about how some of these Zionist charities are basically scamming people for relief funds. At the time, there were a fair number of elderly Holocaust survivors still around there. They were living in poverty, and they were basically, these groups were scamming them. They're scamming the public, and very little of this money actually got to real Holocaust survivors. And just got this whole industry going on. And he obviously got a firestorm of criticism for that. Anyway, he ran into a fight with Alan Dershowitz. Alan Dershowitz wrote this book. Alan Dershowitz is a Harvard law professor. He's famous, supposedly an expert in constitutional law. At the time, he was like a famous civil libertarian, considered to be an arch liberal at the time. He wrote this book called The Case for Israel. I've read parts of it. It's crap. His book basically goes over the Zionist tropes that, there's a Zionist slogan, like Palestine or Israel was a land without people for a people without land. And it's nonsense that the Palestinians already live there. It's nonsense. Also a trope that say the Palestinians, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, incited the Holocaust, incited the Nazis to begin the Holocaust. Which is also nonsense, and he goes over a few other things. So Finkelstein tore this book to pieces. Also, Dershowitz plagiarized. He literally plagiarized Mark Twain in the book. So anyway, Dershowitz went on the attack against Finkelstein, basically got him pushed out of academia. His tenure wasn't renewed, I think 2008, 2009. American academia, or maybe academia in general, is like an odd caste system. Like once you're pushed out, you can't get back in. It's a weird kind of guild caste system. Anyway, he was pushed out. Finkelstein was pushed out of academia, and he sort of had a second career. He was on the lecture circuit, lecturing on atrocities of Israel and Israel-Palestine conflict, and he came out against BDS, the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. It was a revival of the earlier movement against South Africa and Israel, against Israel, started in 2005. Finkelstein saw some ambiguities in this. He basically supports a two-state solution. I don't know Norman Finkelstein's politics. He was Maoist. He was sympathetic to China about decades ago. I get the impression he's kind of considers himself a communist in a very super abstract sense. But he said, right now this is the system we have. We have to operate around bourgeois legality. So he thinks, he sees a contradiction at the heart of the BDS movement that they're unclear whether, they're against Israeli oppression of the Palestinians, but what do you mean by that? Like after the 1967 borders, before, like they're ambiguous. BDS movement is ambiguous on Israel's right to exist. And people ask BDS, well, what's your take on Israel? Well, we don't have a state. We don't have a BDS. People would say, well, we don't have a position on Israel. Well, people would then say, well, we don't have a position on you. And I'm not sure if I agree with Finkelstein's analysis. I mean, he does a lot of insight, brings up some points. But anyway, he alienated a lot of his audience, a lot of his basis, and lecture fees are dried up for him, basically. And he went through about 7 years of unemployment, went through hard times. He's now teaching at a university in Turkey. He has an apartment in Brooklyn, New York, in an Arab neighborhood, but he commutes to Turkey every few months, goes back and forth. I thought about doing something like that myself. But anyway, so Finkelstein emphasized in this interview that, it's not focused on me. Don't want to get into self-pity. It's the Palestinian struggle we have to focus on. Don't worry about my own situation. I like to contrast this with AOC, who's, she lived through the cops. She was in DC during the Capitol riot, and goes on and on how traumatic it was for her. She was not even in the same building. She was in a different building. She was never in harm's way, but she's milking that for all it's worth. Well, Finkelstein has much more dignity about it. He was a martyr, and he's a hero, even though I don't fully agree with him. He has basically handled that with a lot more dignity and honor. Okay. Okay, so there was a 48-hour Arab-Israeli general strike, and it showed amazing solidarity of the Palestinian community, which hasn't happened very much recently, for less than 48. Palestinian solidarity, all the parts with Gaza, the Arab Israelis, traditionally Arab Israelis are off on their own. They weren't really connected with the situation in Gaza or the West Bank, but it showed an amazing amount of solidarity. So the next day, the IDF declared a ceasefire. And many people on the left jumped on that and said, it's a great victory for the working class. The Palestinian workers in Israel forced a ceasefire. I don't think this is true. I think it's nonsense. Let me explain. I support the general strike, and it's a great tactic. I strongly support it, but it did not force a ceasefire. It's totally ridiculous. Let me unpack this here a bit. Okay, so there are 300,000 migrant workers in Israel, non-citizens. The citizen population of Israel, as far as I know, is 7.5 million, close to that. But there are 300,000 migrant workers in Israel, mostly from the Philippines and Thailand, other countries as well, Ukraine, various African countries. 100,000 of these people, they're illegally. They work in occupations mostly agriculture, construction, and there are 30,000 Filipinos or Filipinas, women from the Philippines, who work in like low-skilled, unskilled, low-skilled healthcare section, like working orderlies, working in a group home, and things. I've had jobs like that. They generally in this country they're pretty low and kind of crappy. I mean, it's a good thing to do, helping people, but they're low pay and crappy. So I assume the same in Israel. So the Filipinos work in that sector. Okay, 300,000, and they don't have many rights. They don't have much mobility. They're usually in Israel for 2-year contracts. Okay, so there are 1.5 million Arab Israelis in Israel. 1.5 million. Of that, there's huge unemployment. That's too in that community. There's 40% of men are employed, and about 18% of women. So my math skills are not the world's greatest, but I think this come out to average to 30%. So what's 30% of 1.5 million? Something like 400,000 or a little over that, a little like 300,000, maybe 400,000, we'll say. This is, and I'm a little bit more, somewhat more than the migrant workers. The upshot of it, what I'm trying to say is, the Arab Israeli workers don't have a lot of leverage. Since the Oslo Accords in '95, there's been a concerted effort to get rid of the Arabs, push them out. They can't totally get rid of them because they're 20% of the Arab Israelis are 20% of the population. They can't totally get rid of them, but they're trying very hard to do this. They want to replace them with migrants, replace them with other people. They want to get rid of the Arabs, minimize the Arabs in the workforce as much as possible. So there's sharp limits to their leverage. Someone compared this to the Arab Israelis to the workers in Russia in 1917. They were numerically small, but I think it's a wrong comparison. It's like apples and oranges, totally different the situation we're talking about here. So Hamas, many journalists, wide range of Arab journalists, those Western journalists, Max Blumenthal, Vanessa Beeley, Leith Marouf, many journalists who are on the ground observe it. They they're secular. These people generally say the consensus is that Hamas is regarded as the military wing of the opposition. Max Blumenthal said, most working class Palestinians do not like or support Hamas. They're not Islamists, they don't support them, but they do strongly support the Al Qassam brigades, the military wing of Hamas. They are the military wing of the resistance. Like it or not, they are regarded as the military branch of the resistance. So Hamas forced the ceasefire. It's a great victory for Hamas. Leith Marouf, really interesting journalist. He's on Twitter. I believe he's Lebanese. He's Beirut based. And it's fascinating interview with him. Uh, Basically, he said, I'm secular. I don't like Hamas. I don't share their vision of society, but the fact is they are fighting the Israeli aggression. And he said their missiles, how many of them were fireworks or actual missiles? People believe they repurposed Israeli missiles and they used them much greater accuracy, much greater range, and they were able to targeted So Hamas targeted the Ashkelaz, the second most important port in Israel. They took out two regional airports, took them out of commission. They apparently have Coronet missiles, which are a type of guided anti-tank missiles, and they effectively use them. They early on targeted and killed the the IDF commander of IDF communications within Gaza. They killed him, and his aides, pretty early on. They took out a bunch of IDF tanks. They blocked the invaded Gaza base and the invasion route of Gaza. And early on, IDF called off their ground invasion of Gaza. They were scheduled, they were expected to have an invasion. They early on called off. They claimed it was a communication snafu and they never planned invasion, but yeah, right. They called it off. Like, oh shit, what are we getting into here? They sensed something was a little different. Laith Maruf claims Hamas got the Coronet missiles from Syria by way of Soleimani, the commander, Revolutionary Guards commander who was killed by the U.S. last year. And Hamas is kind of an opportunist organization. They did support an Islamist faction against in Syria for a while against Assad. Then they realized they made a mistake. That they apologized. Oh, okay, sorry. They're in the process of reforming an alliance with Assad now, and there is we've talked about the axis of resistance with Iran and other countries which are resisting Zionism and U.S. imperialism. And referring to an earlier video I made, I don't support the theocracy of Iran. I don't like Assad, but they are fighting U.S. imperialism in the region, and I support them. I support the axis of resistance insofar as they are fighting U.S. imperialism in the region. So Laith Maruf says Hamas delivered an ultimatum to the IDF, like, cease your operations in Gaza, cease bombing Gaza, or we're going to carpet bomb Israel. I have no idea if Hamas had that capability. Laith Maruf may be exaggerating. He seems credible. He may be exaggerating or over enthusiastic. I don't know. But this is what forced the ceasefire. It was a victory for Hamas, and we have to face the fact it's not palatable for the left. And back to Norman Finkelstein, someone asked him, like, does Israel have a right to defend itself? They said that is an absurd question. To me, the question does not make any sense. Israel is overwhelmingly the aggressor. What are they defending themselves against? Like asking the Germans invading Poland, the Second World War, do the Germans have a right to defend themselves? Like, what is Israel defending itself against? They are overwhelmingly the aggressor. Okay, so anyway, brings up some points about two-state solution versus a one-state solution, whether it's accurate or useful to characterize Israel as a settler colonial state, whether apartheid is a good term to use, orientation towards BDS, and so on. There are several socialist organizations I was in or close to. And I'm not bashing them, I'm just saying this, I was a member of Socialist Alternative in the largest Trotskyist organization here, so for 10 years. I left several years ago because they leave to 2018 because they're turned towards Bernie Sanders in 2016, increasing closeness to the Democratic Party, the DSA. Recently, Shama Sawan, I think the organization as a whole, is joining the DSA. I would totally oppose this, and I didn't feel I could be a member of an organization I didn't fully agree with their politics. I was in 10 years. Half the time I was very active. The other half I was not as active as I would have liked. But okay, so then there was a little while after I left, I think last year or maybe a year and a half ago now, there was a split. No, sorry, Socialist Alternative in the U.S. is part of an international, was part of an international, the CWI, the Committee for Workers International. Technically, they're not a member. They're in political solidarity with the Committee for Workers International, headquartered in Britain. Peter Taft was the long-term leader. Okay, so there was a split sometime after I left, a year and a half ago, I think. Mainly bureaucratic fighting. I get not over any real thing I would care about that much bureaucratic infighting. So a large chunk of the organization left. They formed a group called the ISA, the International Socialist Alternative. So the U.S. Socialist Alternative Organization, Shama Sawan in Seattle is a city council person. She's kind of famous from the left. She's in Socialist Alternative. They Socialist Alternative in the U.S. is now a member or associated with the ISA, International Socialist Alternative. While the main group, the parts of the former leadership, is still the CWI, and there's been a split, a lot of splits in Socialist Alternative. Big one, the Worcester branch split over support for Bernie Sanders and things like that. I have friends and I like them. I have some disagreements with them, but I interviewed Nick Wurst from from that group. They split from Socialist Alternative, from the International Socialist Group, the ISG, and they re-affiliated with the CWI. Bit complicated. Hope you're following all this now. The Trotskyist movement in internationally has, in the left in general, but Trotskyist movement mostly is famous for lots of zillions of splits and complicated reasons why. Okay. So the upshot of it is, I'm not in an organization. I haven't been in an organization for a while. I was close to the IG, the Internationalist Group, for a time. They pride themselves on being more radical than all the other organizations. I was kind of close to them for a time. I was in their periphery. I don't think I ever would have joined. But so briefly, some takes on it. The Socialist Alternative and both groups now, CWI and the ISA, the two groups, they both support a two-state solution. They don't believe, like none of these organizations believe settler colonial theory is accurate, and so on. So my take on this, my pushback, first, settler colonialism is valid theory. I don't know how far back it goes. It came out of the academic left. I don't know how far back the theory goes, but the basic idea is that one country, the imperial country, the colonialist country, conquers and dominates the population of another country and settles it with replaces the indigenous population. Sometimes either exterminates the indigenous population, assimilates it, otherwise subjugates it, or usually a mixture of all these. And there's a continuum. It's not all exactly the same. There's a continuum. The classic settler states are of course, countries were originated as British colonies, the U.S., Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Israel, which actually also was a British colony. Okay, they're the classic settler states. Okay, so it's and some people expand maybe Argentina is a settler state. Some people consider the countries resulting from the Spanish conquest. Most of those countries are settler states. It has been expanded anyway. For the sake of this, class struggle in these places is it being a settler state profoundly affects class struggle. There is class struggle, but it's warped or it comes out differently than in some other places. The lower classes of the settler population, some of the working classes or more marginalized layers, are pitted against the indigenous or remnants of the indigenous population for control resources, and they often become politically far right wing or ultra nationalist. Not some examples from in U.S. history. Not Bacon's rebellion in colonial Virginia, I believe it was in the late 1600s. It was an uprising. Not Bacon himself was a Virginia aristocrat, but he joined like a lead of farmers and workers uprising against the Virginia colonial aristocracy. They united with Africans. This was before black chattel slavery had begun. They brought in Africans. The British brought in Africans as indentured servants, but they could be freed. They wasn't lifetime of indentured servant, racial-based slavery, lifetime slavery, as it later became. So, not Bacon, for a time, united whites and poor blacks against the colonial aristocracy. Okay, and as a result, the aristocracy introduced black chattel slavery. They were terrified of blacks and whites unifying. Anyway, the upshot of this, for my point, is that this uprising was directed against Native Americans. They were encroaching on Indians' land. and there were bitter wars. And the Indians, the Native Americans tribes, actually were also an agricultural people, so it's like the same mode of production. In effect, they were also an agricultural people, but they were fighting against the Native Americans, and they were upset at their own aristocracy for not backing them up. That's the thing. The settlers, whoever they were in colonial Virginia, did not have solidarity with the Native Americans. They were pitted against them. That's just one minor example. There are so many other examples. Noel Ignatieff had a theory. He wrote How the Irish Became White and Race Trader. He developed a lot of theory around that left wing theory around racism in the United States. He had a theory of the U.S. evolved as we called a Herrenvolk state, which meant Herrenvolk is master race. Like there's certainly class struggle in the U.S., but it's played out within the context of we're all white people, we're all the master race. And this, profoundly affected the course of class struggle. It's one of the reasons there isn't a major socialist movement. I mean, there was, but why we don't have like a major social democratic party, and one of the reasons, not the only party in the U.S. today. We can see this also in South Africa, and it was settled by the Dutch, taken over by the British. The Dutch actually were there they came in the 17th century. They developed their own language and culture. Afrikaans evolved out of Dutch, and they have their own literature and so on. 1920, they were oppressed by the British. There was an Afrikaner working class revolt in 1922. There's a huge strike wave in South Africa. And the motto of the South African Communist Party had a big following for a time. Their motto was in 1922, "Workers of the world unite for a white South Africa." And the Comintern, the Communist International, did not like that, so they cut this out, and they ended it. Sometime a bit later, in the mid-1930s, I believe, Leon Trotsky wrote several letters to his followers in South Africa, essentially saying in no uncertain terms, you have to orient towards the African liberation struggle, which implied that they weren't. And what I read in South Africa, history of the white working class in South Africa, they've never connected with the African liberation struggle in all the years of apartheid. They've never, I mean, some individuals have, but there were no cases of the white working class or joining the African liberation struggle. It just hasn't happened. Some individuals have, but as all, it just never happened. Other Algeria, of course, Algeria is another case. The Pieds Noirs, they were kind of originally poor, marginalized people from France. They were often a lot of these people were Alsatians, I believe. There were some Spaniards and some people from Spain and Italy and so on, but they supported the Communist Party was fairly big. They were the Pieds Noirs were the dominant group in the French Communist Party, and largely because of that, the French Communist Party had a horrible take on French colonialism. They basically supported colonialism. They were not supported by the Arabs in Algeria. So they never had the settlers never had any solidarity with the Arabs. It just doesn't work that way. There are other cases in history as well. So Israel is a settler state. There's no way around it. Now, people talk about, well, hope the Israeli working class would rise up and join with the Palestinians. There's very little chance of that happening. Let me explain. National Socialist Review, I believe they come out of the UK, has an interesting article. I believe they come out of the Socialist Workers, the UK Socialist Workers Party. They've been called the Cliffite, so they probably hate this term. But the Cliffite orientation, I disagree with much of their orientation. I strongly disagree with the third campism, but I do find myself agreeing with some of their Middle East policy. Anyway, this article of the ISR quotes or basically repeats arguments by Moshe Machover, who was the leader of Matzpan, an Israeli Trotskyist group, which fell apart, but when they existed, they were badass, and they were really badass revolutionaries, and they had some interesting takes. So this article, I don't 100% agree with the article, but it mentions there on Moshe Machover's analysis, and it's really interesting. It said one quote, it said something like, in 50 years, they wrote this in 1970s. He collaborated with someone else, an Israeli labor activist who had been a Zionist, left. They said, in effect, Israel is a settler colonial state. By the way, settler colonial theory was first applied to Israel by a French Marxist historian, Maxime Ronson, who was kicked out of the French Communist Party. Actually, a very intense scholar. Interesting. He had an article in 1967 developing Israel as a settler state. I think he's 100% accurate. Anyway, so the analysis, Moshe Machover and someone else whose name I've forgotten, but an Israeli labor activist who was originally Zionist but left Zionism, they wrote an analysis of the Israeli working class. They said, in effect, that they wrote this in the 1970s, but said in the past 50 years, there has never been any instances of the Israeli working class aligning with the Palestinian cause. They say the Israeli working class is a unique working class. It developed in conjunction with the Zionist project. And they're not going to turn against it. They developed in conjunction with the Zionist project. And it's unique working class. They will never. And then they wrote this 50 years ago. And since the next, almost like 40 years ago, and there haven't been any cases since, very few cases since that time. Today, most of the Israeli working class are Mizrahim, Arab Jews. Most come from Morocco, or some come from Iraq, Iran, which is not an Arab country, but they come from various Arab-speaking countries. They came to Israel in the 1950s. They're now about 50% of the Jewish population are Mizrahi. They're politically far right wing. They were discriminated against in the 50s and 60s, and they still discriminated against. They were sort of blocked from upward mobility for the most part, and they formed the basis of Likud party in the 70s, which fueled Israel's turn to the right. And they support Avigdor Lieberman, who also the Russian immigrants are also fairly right wing in Israel. There's big supporters of Avigdor Lieberman, who's basically fascistic. So most of the Israeli blue collar working class as Mizrahi, as a rule, they're far right. When people said that if there was a working class uprising in Israel, they would probably demand even stronger measures against the Palestinians. So I think the chances for Israeli Jewish working class alliance with the Palestinian struggle is pretty minimal. Like, it's never happened in a lot of other places. Not saying it's impossible, but it's extremely difficult. People are like of a one-dimensional Marxism. Like, yeah, so used to have the slogan like black and white, unite and fight, like overly facile. If it were that easy, capitalism would have been overthrown a long time ago. Okay, so in most of the blue collar Israeli working class are Mizrahim Jews from mostly Arab speaking countries, are from the Middle East. Most are from Morocco, a lot are from Iraq, Iran, which is not an Arab country, and other places. They've been in Israel since like the 1950s. They've been harshly discriminated against, especially by the liberal Zionism. The Histrudat labor union really screwed them over, kind of. Zionist labor union screwed them over. They were kind of blocked for upward mobility, and they're the blue collar working class, and Israel's now entirely Mizrahi. Um, they're politically far right wing. They were supporters of Likud. They feel the Likud party, uh, uh, which represented Israel in the late 70s. Israel's turned to the right. Um, and also now big supporters of Avigdor Lieberman, right wing, basically fascist politician in Israel. So they're pretty far right wing. Much of the Israeli working class is far right wing. Not saying they all are, but I mean the chances for solidarity with Palestinians is almost minimal. It would never happen unless like a zombie apocalypse or something. So I think some of these dynamics, settler state dynamics, we see it played out in Israel. It's extremely difficult to get solidarity between the different communities. Um, the IG Internationalist Group, they mentioned the fact that they don't like settler state idea because they compare it to the French or the Pied Noir in Algeria, French Algeria. There were 10% of the population. They could go back to France, and they and then the CWI and the ISA have this idea too that the Nakba. They don't like to use the term Nakba. I think that smacks of Arab nationalism. It means catastrophe. 1948, which is ongoing, still an ongoing process. I think they share away from this term because it smacks of Arab nationalism. But anyway, They the expulsion of the Palestinians was a horrible tragedy, but in the 70 years since that time, the Jewish working class has evolved, has developed, and we have to offer them something. Well, I don't know about that analysis. It's kind of flawed because I said the Jewish working class is fully embedded with the Zionist project. Now, there's a difference between Algeria and Israel. The French and Algeria hope to exploit the Arabs using for cheap labor on farms and plantations and things like that. Didn't quite work out that way. But Israel, the purpose of the Zionist project is a little different. And it's different from some other recent settler states. Their program is to completely expel the indigenous population, erase them from history, get rid of them, and replace them with build a Jewish nation. They have a different project. And the working class has been, Jewish working class has been integral to this project. They've been fully a part of it, even in their left wing phrase. There's Histrudat and left wing Zionism. Histrudat was a Zionist labor federation. They owned a chunk of businesses, and Israel claimed to be socialist. Even in that stage, they did not like Palestinians. Were not going to be part of it. So even back in that stage, and now they're even further right wing. So the working class has evolved in this direction. So I don't have any easy answers, but I'd say above all, it's a Palestinian struggle. It's a Palestinian national struggle. Of course, it inevitably has class dynamics. The Palestinian leadership in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority is corrupt. Al Fatah is very corrupt, totally lost credibility. Interesting, Laith Marouf, the journalist, has some interesting things to say about Al Fatah. The youth wing, effectively, which is half their membership, effectively split from Al Fatah, and a group, one of their main militias, the Al Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, split, and they did split. So they're kind of falling, Al Fatah's falling apart, but they're a corrupt, brutal dictatorship. Now compare like the West Bank to Gaza. The West Bank gave up their right to self-defense. And as a result, now they have, 800, one thing I read, 800,000 settlers. And they get in their corrupt, brutal, basically dictatorship of Al-Fatah, the Palestinian Authority is a puppet of Israel, right, by corrupt Palestinian businessmen. So Gaza kept their right to self-defense. Unfortunately, it's Hamas, but they kept their right to self-defense. And they kept their own land. But as a result, they're brutally, constantly bombarded by Israel. So it's interesting comparison to make. So I think above all, it's a Palestinian national struggle. We should focus on that, not. I don't. A two-state solution at this stage is not feasible. The West Bank is riddled with settlements, facts on the ground, as Israelis call it, just utterly riddled with settlements. It just, in fact, it already is a one state, but it's an ethno state. Just keep the state, but get rid of Jewish. Not keep the state, but get rid of Jewish supremacy. It's a complicated question. I don't have all the answers, but I don't think a two-state solution is not feasible at all. And it should be focused on a Palestinian national struggle. Mike Illey, who's Maoist, founder of Kasama Project, he's still on Facebook. I disagree with almost everything he says. I enjoy debating him. He's a really comradely debater, but I literally disagree with everything he says. But he had some interesting take. He said, really the only way the victory for the Palestinian struggle is a catastrophic decline in U.S. power. And I think he may be right, or a partial decline in U.S. power. Maybe the U.S. ruling class, under a lot of tension, would say, wait, uncritical support for Israel is not. I don't think it's too likely, but anyway, decline in U.S. power, the collapse of the empire, combined with struggle inside Palestine, combined with international struggle. Like the IG article was kind of revealing. It had one thing that said, where would the Israeli Jews, the working class, go? And well, they can't go to South Florida. Interesting. They implied that Zionism would collapse from an outside military conquest. They implied that. They didn't directly say it, but outside military conquest. And the only state capable of doing this would be Iran. So interesting. So unspoken assumption there that unspoken assumption that they can't live in a state where they're not the dominant group. The ISA had to take the CWI was two state. two-state solution, and then joining struggles between Palestinians and the Israeli working class. It's not real. Their formulation is breezy, not realistic at all. The CW, the ISA is a little more harder edged. They talk about a socialist Israel joining a socialist Palestine, socialist Israel, then a socialist Palestine, maybe eventually some federation. Um, that just seems weird. A socialist Israel would no longer be Israel; it would be Palestine. I mean, uh, socialist Israel, supposing there's much of the population of Israel, 20% is Palestine, and you include the West Bank and Gaza and the surrounding area, it's much larger. A socialist Israel will no longer be Israel. If they get rid of Zionism, they will be Palestine. So I don't get why the opposition to a two-state solution. As far as apartheid, all three of these organizations I mentioned oppose the term apartheid. Applied to South Africa, their idea it's a different situation economically. Apartheid system in South Africa was when the white ruling class dominated a black proletarian, and it was racial caste system, racial oppression combined with economic exploitation. This situation in Israel is somewhat different, not exactly the same. There's certainly work, but the oppression is more of a national oppression. So the apartheid is not correct from a Marxist viewpoint. I see their point, but like, so what? I mean, it's an accurate term. It means type of national racial oppression. It's just as it's so what? I mean, I think it's a valid term. It's sort of Marxist nitpicking. There are differences. There are differences, but I think it's a valid term. And finally, BDS. The BDS boycott, divestment, sanctions movement started in 2005. Yeah, I would support it. I mean, yes, consumer boycotts have limits. They're not going to take down apartheid. They're not going to take down Zionism. I mean, when I was in socialist alternative, people constantly pointed out, it was class struggle inside South Africa, which took down apartheid. It wasn't the outside what BDS movement. Yeah, but class struggle is not direct class struggle in Israel is not capable, for the reasons I mentioned, is not capable of taking down Zionism. Of course, warfare is another form of class struggle. Someone, I forget who, and I wish I could remember this. Oh, Trotsky quoted Clausewitz, the famous Prussian military theorist, saying, war is politics by other means. So warfare can be class struggle by other means. Class struggle isn't just strikes and labor actions, which is very important. But I mean, the Hamas attacks could be a form of class struggle as well, even though it's carried out by a petty bourgeois, religious, obscurantist reactionary group. So there are different forms of struggle, but classic, as they mean it, classic class struggle brought down the system in South Africa. A little more complicated, but basically, yeah, Western banks had sanctions. Finally, at the very end, it's like Bank of America and Goldman Sachs said to South Africa, "We're going to cut you off. This is too much. The brewing struggle was too much, too excessive. We're going to cut you off," and that's what finally forced them to. Okay, but anyway, this is not analogous to Israel internal, like Palestinian internal struggle. Is not going to take down Zionism. They're a much smaller part of the population, and the relationship to the Israeli ruling class is different. Their IDF is extremely powerful military. So it's going to be a national conflict, and I don't know how to play it. So anyway, I think the BDS movement is useful in educating people. The U.S. American people are probably the most propagandized people on the planet. The media is constantly bombarding pro-Israeli, the Israeli viewpoint. I have friends of mine who I thought were kind of lefties who turned surprisingly being pro-Israeli. Well, we got to consider. I was surprised by this, but they're constant diet on the media on this. So people like activists are rightfully outraged what Israel is doing, and they want to, and the distortions of the media and U.S. carte blanche for whatever Israel wants to do. So they want to do something, and they work on not just consumer boycotts. Like the IG article made fun of that. It's like refusing to buy a Sabra hummus is going to destroy Zionism. No, but institutional boycotts, institutional sanctions can have some effect, but no, they're not going to take down Zionism. But in the U.S., it's important a way of educating people, working, hand out flyers, and educating people about Zionism. I mean, so as long as activists involved in BDS, it's a good thing to do. But as long as activists don't have any illusions, kind of understand what's happening, I support the BDS movement. I think it's a good thing to do. They kind of socialist alternative kind of shies away from this and leans towards like Arab nationalism, which Anyway, my take on this, just direct class struggle, as people usually mean this, is not going to take down Zionism. It's in the context of an overall Arab revolution, which has been going on for the past 100 years, on and off, and is largely mostly a national struggle as well. We have to understand this. Two-state solution can't work. We don't have to bend over backwards. The nuts. The As I mentioned, much of the Israeli working class is Mizrahi and very far right wing. The ISA article did quote this labor federation, a leftist split from Histrudat. Histrudat was a Zionist labor federation. They, kind of like the AFL-CIO. They're kind of crappy now, but there's some left splits from it. And this one group, one organization called Kok Lovdem, and they're kind of left wing. They apparently had a march of 18,000 people, and they say there's some evidence of some small parts of the Israeli working class, getting sick of the war, maybe expressing solidarity with Palestinians. That may be true, and it's a good sign. If it is, it's a good sign. But I think it's very small, very little. I mean, could change. I could be wrong. I hope I am, but I'm not optimistic. And there's stories of protests recently of liberals in Israel protesting against what's been happening in Gaza. There were some good signs, mostly liberals. Some studies show that income levels, the higher income level someone in Israel has, the more politically liberal they are. The lower income level is more right wing they are. I mean, income level is not a Marxist analysis of class exactly, but it's some indication anyway. So it's an uphill battle to build class solidarity. It's not likely. Some small groups might split off, but as some groups, working people may, but I think it's very small and highly unlikely. I think any hope would come from some kind of diminution of the massive U.S. support, above all. Decline of the U.S. empire, struggle inside Israel among the Palestinians, labor struggle as well as military struggle, and outside help from a country like Iran or China or Russia. Russia right now is close ties with Israel, but if they change. Anyway, one more thing I forgot. Laith Farouf mentioned Jordan. Jordan said there was recently, a few months ago, there was a coup attempt in Jordan, supported by MBS, the Mohammed bin Salman, the Mr. Bonesaw, as they call him. He was in complicit or ordered the murder of Khashoggi, the journalist, gruesously murdered. He was in the Saudi consulate in Turkey, and they literally chopped him up with a chainsaw. And grisly. So anyway, he apparently was behind a coup attempt in Jordan to overthrow the King Abdullah, replace him with his half-brother, who would be Jordan is in the U.S. orbit, but they did not sign the Abraham Accords, which some of the Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, some Arab states did. Basically completely sold out. So what this coup would have done is Jordan then would have some nominal authority over, say, the West Bank and Jerusalem, would give it to Saudi Arabia and give the Saudis carte blanche, who would then give the Israelis carte blanche to do anything they wanted to. But the coup failed. And so there were thousands, one protest march, thousands of Palestinians in Jordan overran the IDF, the Israeli border station, marched several miles into Israel to express solidarity with their cousins, with their relatives in occupied West Bank. So that was an interesting development. Laith Marouf says, if Jordan somehow, not likely, if Jordan leaves the U.S. orbit, that could be a game changer right there. And above all, the media narrative has changed. The New York Times, this is amazing, had front page article to the 60 children who were killed in the recent bombing of Gaza. They never would have done that. The readership is probably plummeting. I've heard that readers are pissed. I mean, the Zionist constituency is declining in the U.S., and some of this is filtering into the mainstream corporate media, which has been very unusual. CNN is slightly more nuanced, slightly more balanced. And so we'll see what happens. It's an ongoing struggle. And anyway, I hope you enjoy my video. Please like and subscribe. Don't be too pissed off at me. I'm welcome debates with opponents, with somebody from in the CWI, the ISA, or IG. I welcome a debate. If seriously, I've had people on who I don't completely agree with, but I have comradely debates, very respectful, kind. I welcome debating anyone on my show. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you very much. Bye.